So this is the video a lot of you were expecting to see on Monday, but I wasn't here. I was like 200 miles away. I was up on Hadrian's Wall doing stuff. So I'm doing it today instead because there's been much more fallout around this particular incident than I would have thought. So it seems that the stewards have now taken a dim view on this thing that seems native to one of the Red Bulls. After several laps of making the corner with absolutely no issue whatsoever, whenever a car appears on the outside and tries to swing it around the outside to take the position, the Red Bull, and it seems to only happen to one of the Red Bulls, Verstappen's Red Bull that is, and not to Perez's car, that Red Bull suddenly develops a problem where it can't turn left. And before people start crying in the comments, that entire bit was exaggerated for comic effect. You don't need to take it so seriously. But there is still an element of truth to this. Allow me to explain. In the video I did nearly 2 weeks ago now in response to what happened at the US Grand Prix, the whole video was essentially don't hate the player, hate the game. Because the FIA's rulebook essentially says if you arrive at the apex first, you have all rights to the corner and the other guy has to give way. And it inadvertently creates this culture whereby the drivers can think, if I chuck it in, the other guy has to move. It doesn't matter where on the track I'm going in. If I'm going to throw it into Lesmo 2, he has to give me room. Doesn't matter if I make the apex or overshoot it, I got there first. And this is a rule that Verstappen seems to have mastered. And it's why I said, hate the game, not the player, despite multiple people crying British bias in the comments, even though I said that the rules were the rules, and Lando was penalised as per those rules. But that involves people listening, and it just seems that some are incapable of doing it. Or they just came in assuming that because of what it says on my passport, my opinion is immediately invalid, because, oh look, the guy in the orange car has the same passport that I do, even though he's also entitled to a Belgian one. And yes, it does indeed say British citizen on this passport, but then again, it's a bit out of date because if I turn it the right way around, it still says Her Britannic Majesty and Her Majesty. It's also burgundy and not blue, but it's valid until 2029, so I'm going to hang on to it for as long as I possibly can. But the thing is, what happened at Mexico at the weekend is now a case of a driver taking it up to the line, but now he might have just, overstepped it slightly. Schumacher and Senna are two drivers that also did this. When it comes to hard racing, those two guys are celebrated, and whenever they turn up on the highlight reels, the comments are full of people going on about how it was real racing, proper, real drivers in real cars, and other nostalgic words that you want to throw at that footage. Saying that, I saw some footage of Schumacher just this morning, and I could have sworn that the footage was sped up. But it's just that the cars were tiny compared to how they are now, and that was 20 years ago. It was when he forced Montoya off at Imola. But while Schumacher and Senna pushed things to the limit as to how far they could take things, you'd have to be a die-hard fan who thinks they can do no wrong to, ignore the things that might, should, or did get them on the wrong side of the authorities. Schumacher's incident with Jacques Villeneuve at Jerez is a prime example. Schumacher had moments where, in the heat of a moment, he would do something that would be considered unsporting, and that was one of them. Although Villeneuve's move was quite similar to how things have been working with Verstappen in some cases. The Canadian singer-songwriter was probably never making that corner and overshooting it, but under today's rules, he got to the apex first, so it's his corner. The following year, Schumacher was given a 10-second stop-go penalty for coming out of the pits in Montreal and chopping right across Frentzen, putting him onto the grass, and then the Williams ended up in a wall. That's one occasion where the Michael crossed the line. 2 years later, he took it right up to the limit, moving over to block Hakkinen on the Kemmel Straight, right up to the limit of what was allowed. It was a little bit naughty, but it was all within the rules. Again, right up to the limit of what was allowed. Fast forward 25 or 26 years, and here we are again. It's Verstappen taking it right up to the limit of what is possible, because under the FIA's own guidelines, he can. And Verstappen has admitted that the 10-second penalty he received for what happened at turn 7 was probably justified. And I think it was. Verstappen simply threw the car in, didn't make the corner, and made Norris go outwards. And given how little runoff there is compared to other corners at that particular track, or any other track for that matter, and it's not really a corner that you would overtake on, the 10 seconds sounds like a fair cop. But this is where stuff online has been going ham in recent days. But what about Russell? He only got 5 seconds as well. But what about this? But what about that? It's one rule for the Brits and one rule for everybody else. But it isn't. Here is the report from the United States Grand Prix involving Yuki Tsunoda and Alex Albon. Yuki was deemed to have forced Alex off the road at turn 12, which is the same corner the Norris-Verstappen incident happened, and that Yuki has been given a 5-second time penalty instead of the usual 10, due to mitigating circumstances. Those mitigating circumstances being that while it is against the rules to force a driver off the road, it was deemed to not be deliberate, and that Yuki was in control of his car. If it really was British bias, then Yuki should have got the full 10. Right? The same way that Lando was given the mitigating circumstances of the only reason he was off the track in the first place is because Max put him there, but because he overtook off the track, he still gets the 5 seconds, where it should have been 10, but again, the mitigating circumstances. So I think that's fair, and it's consistent with what happened with Yuki and Alex, and Russell got exactly the same penalty that Yuki did. So all of that is consistent, which is what we want, right? And here's another one that I missed while first putting all of this together. Document 66 from the US Grand Prix weekend is for Pierre Gasly leaving the track and gaining a lasting advantage, and this being at turn 15 as he battled with Albon. And as the document says, Gasly was level with Alex at the apex and then dropped back ever so slightly. As he was behind when he left the track and gained a lasting advantage, the stewards imposed a penalty of 5 seconds instead of the usual 10 because of the mitigating circumstances of the margins being so incredibly fine when Gasly left the track to overtake Albon, given how things worked out with everything and their guidelines and so on and so forth. So, Russell got 5 seconds, Yuki got 5 seconds, Norris got 5 seconds, and Gasly got 5 seconds. And Gasly did pretty much the same thing Norris did, just at a different corner. Mitigating circumstances in all 4 accounts of a driver being forced off the road or cars leaving the track and gaining an advantage. So 5 seconds isn't exclusive to George or Lando and the fact that they have British passports. You can read all of the stewards' reasoning online. This is the stewards' report for what happened at turn 4. The stewards note that Norris was ahead of Verstappen in all 3 phases of the corner before he started being shoved off the road, and it's their belief that Norris would have been able to take the inside of turn 5 to complete the move. Max forced Norris out over the grass, which meant Lando took a position from Sainz, but immediately gave that position back. Now, giving the position back to Max probably could have happened in that section too, but would have probably been better to let him by just after turn 11, where there's more of a straight. That's just my opinion, but we never saw Lando give the position back because going into turn 7, Max had thrown it up the inside, and we saw what happened there. I can't believe the biased British media made him do that. I know that's one of my more smarmier takes on things, but there is method to the madness. Max's nationality had nothing to do with him just straight up lobbing it up the inside of Lando, who just happens to be a British driver, and forcing him completely off the road. George Russell is advocating for a permanent panel, which does seem like a good idea on paper, but there's always going to be a bit of controversy surrounding this. The FIA has tried this system before, but they were accused of favouritism. Fast forward to today, and the stewards are still being accused of favouritism, because 2 of the men involved with dishing out the 2 penalties for Max at Mexico were Johnny Herbert, who many harbour a grudge about because he's pro-British drivers, apparently, and Tim Mayer, who is the son of Teddy Mayer, the man who was the boss at McLaren in the 70s after Bruce's death. George also made a point that the overtaking guidelines are simply that. Guidelines, and it's down to a case-by-case basis of how you apply them. The problem is precedent and little bits and pieces that make you go, yeah, but for. Herbert has spoken out since the carnage caused by his decision at the Mexican Grand Prix, saying, "Was Verstappen's driving style on the edge or over the top? Yes, it was. Verstappen's driving style was harsh, especially when he's taking a fellow driver off the track. It's an absolute no-no from me, current drivers, former drivers, and stewards. I'm such a big fan of Verstappen, and it frustrates me massively when he drives the way he did in Mexico. He doesn't need to do it. He's so good in the cockpit, and at this point in the championship, he just needs to stay out of trouble and drive as well as possible. When Verstappen goes into this horrible mindset of trying to gain an advantage by taking a fellow driver off the racetrack so Ferrari can get the 1-2, that is where Verstappen needs to know he doesn't have to do that. Just win in the cleanest possible way you can." The attitude in the stewards' room was really good, and our decision was clear because the guidelines tell us what to look at and how to deal with the situation. When we applied the 2 10-second penalties to Verstappen, we were all in agreement. Always remember there are 4 stewards who make these decisions. A couple of those paragraphs probably shouldn't have been said in the way they were said, if at all, because it just adds fuel to the fire, and people are going to interpret it in different ways, either because of language barrier, reading comprehension, whatever it might be. But That's just my opinion. And Verstappen interpreted it as Herbert saying that, you know, he knew what he was doing when he went into turn 7 or turn 4 or, you know, wherever it was. But, you know, Herbert's always been pretty blunt. But again, he probably shouldn't have said it in the way that he said it. Ask him for his opinion on why they gave the decision out. That's perfectly fine, but the rest of it probably wasn't needed. And Max was recently on a gaming stream, probably with Redline, where he joked that he had the wrong passport. But his passport had nothing to do with his driving standards into turn 7. He also said that things might be easier if the Red Bull was a bit better. When he was out winning every race, or almost every race last year, he didn't need to do any of this not turning left stuff because his car was so superior, he could just blow by everybody. But in 2021, he had to fight Lewis, and now he's having to fight Lando, or at least reduce Lando's points hauls as much as possible. And in both cases, the whole inability to turn left thing, because it's mostly left-hand corners where this kind of thing happens, comes in. I think the problem is that it doesn't matter what the FIA does or who the person giving out the penalties is, there's always going to be chaos online afterwards. Those who support the driver who has been on the receiving end will always cry foul, and if it's somebody who is the nationality of the other driver, there's always going to be claims of bias. So what do? Have a panel of 4 permanent stewards, but you can't have a British steward because Max the Goat 33 on Twitter, who makes supporting Max's whole personality, will get upset if he forces somebody off the road and gets a penalty. You can't have an ex-Red Bull driver like Liuzzi because he's got ties to, well, Red Bull, and Liuzzi was a steward a couple of years ago, but I think he's more in Formula E now. So is the best way to do it like how they do it in football? Allow me to explain. If the match is between Aston Villa and Newcastle, the referee will be appointed from anywhere except the local areas of the teams playing, because he might be a Birmingham City, West Brom, Wolverhampton or Sunderland fan, and that might influence his decisions. In fact, the head of the Professional Football Referee Union, Howard Webb, said that Premier League referees have to declare if they have any specific interests in clubs, such as which team they support, to try and win back the opinion of football fans. Because Stuart Atwell, a Luton Town fan, gave a dodgy decision in Luton's favour last season. So to expand on this, John Brooks from Melton Mowbray doesn't take charge of any matches involving local team Leicester City. Similarly, David Coote, a Notts County fan, doesn't officiate any games involving Nottingham Forest, who play literally the other side of the Trent. Jared Gillett is an Australian who supports Liverpool but doesn't referee any games involving Everton. Funnily enough, Webb was accused for many years of being biased towards Manchester United. It turns out he's a Rotherham fan, and actually insinuating that the refs are biased or have been paid off by another team will result in bans and fines. It's taken quite seriously. So maybe you have a panel of, 5 full-time stewards, and if a British driver is involved, the British guy on the panel can't be involved in that decision to make it a little bit, fairer. But if you have Yuki doing something to Lance, and there isn't a Japanese or Canadian guy on the panel, you then have 5 stewards going into the ins and outs of that particular decision, whereas you had 4 before. And again, that's, there's no way of making it 100% fair. I find the whole British bias thing to be hilarious and boring at the same time. Personally, I think the second penalty was warranted, but looking at the first one, maybe 5 seconds was probably the more apt penalty. But anything other than it was just hard racing is just going to get people called out, like Silverstone 2021. I've always said that it was 2 egos going into one corner. Max wasn't going to budge, Lewis wasn't going to budge. They were both playing with fire, expecting each other to back out, and one driver ended up paying the price for it. But because I didn't say that it was all Hamilton's fault and that Hamilton deliberately fired Max off or worse to that effect, I was called biased, and that driver 61 did a much better video because he said it was Hamilton's fault. But it wasn't bias, I just didn't say what that person wanted to hear. But will it change Max's defensive driving? I don't think it will. Knowing that as long as he finishes a certain amount of points ahead of Lando, he can afford to keep doing it. But I don't think it will happen for the rest of the season because of how few races there are remaining, and Lando seems incapable of making the most out of having a car that good. It's actually borderline inspirational. And for as long as Lando is too nice, then champion this year, next year or any year seems unlikely. Max will do what Max wants, much like Schumacher and Senna did, and that's what makes him so popular. And like Senna and Schumacher, he doesn't want to accept that he at some point did something wrong, and neither can his fans. It's that social media just amplifies everything, and websites going after it for clicks and stoking the fire, intentionally or not, doesn't help either. But really, some of it is drummed up for more clicks. You only have to go onto YouTube or Twitter to see what's what. But all it was at Mexico was just going over the line just a tiny bit. Now, I like elbows out racing. I love touring cars, and that sort of racing is full of it. Bump someone off, you get penalised. Do a bump to pass, you get penalised. And that's happened with so many drivers before, and it's happening again. But like I say, you've got social media and the fans on either side piling on. But all nations give their guys an easier time. I bet the Dutch coverage is incredibly one-sided to Max, Italian towards Ferrari, and so on. But I'm sure there's going to be some lovely rational thoughts on this one. And if you have some, leave them down in the designated comment submission zone under this video and get a discussion going. Is this a case of being like Schumacher where the line is occasionally crossed? Or is it a load of nothing? Or is Max simply incapable of racing people without a god-tier car? That's a question, not a statement, by the way. So then, a look at the fallout surrounding Max's 2 penalties at Mexico last weekend, and the constant calling out of nationalities to stewards, the media, and people on, well, social media. If you thought I've made some good points, then do give this video one of those thumbs up things, and for more stuff from this channel, subscribe and get the bell on, so you never miss out on anything else I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the fine bunch of lads over at Patreon that support at a more personal level. If you want to keep the lights on around here and help contribute to the picture purchasing piggy bank, a link to Patreon is in the description, along with links to Discord, socials and other bits and pieces you might want or need to know, like a link to the F1 store if you want to see if there's any bargains to be had. Oh, and there's also super thanks if you want to top up my coffee cup, and memberships if you don't really want to do Patreon but still do the whole Patreon thing. So until next time, I've been a biased Brit, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.